Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Bellingham City Council. These are afternoon work sessions for December 4th, 2017. Our first committee up is the Justice Committee, and that is chaired by Councilmember April Barker.
Thank you, Council President. I'm joined today with Councilmember Pinky Vargas and Terry Bornman. We have 3 items in the Justice Committee, and the first is looking over a draft resolution for guiding principles for justice and justice-related systems. We spent our last committee going over the 2016 guiding principles for the jail that we signed on with the County Council. Looked at those, brought a lot of suggestions, and then tasked myself with going out and trying to put that all into some guiding principles. So one thing I will say, it was put here for past resolution, but we've had a huge amount of community interest, which is wonderful, and people who are really wanting to make sure that this is exactly the way it needs to be and that is truly guiding us over the next decade, probably. So with that, I just put on the table for now that we might need to go over this, maybe make some more refinements, and then come back at the next, or even bring it to committee of the whole, since it is generating so much interest. So with that said, there is guiding principles for justice and justice-related decisions, draft resolution in the packet. And with that, I can open it up to committee members on what, any thoughts? Terry.
Yeah, I've got a number of questions on some of these.
Let's start with one.
I guess starting with 2 about public safety focused on prevention and early intervention. I think that those are good things. But public safety, by its very nature, I think its first principle is to protect the safety of the public in other things, and then, use, and then also, as part of that, working with prevention and early intervention. For us to leave that part out of it, I think, is a mistake. Mm-hmm. It sounds nice, but it is to, one of our first principles within the public safety system is to protect the public, and this doesn't address that at all.
So what's your suggestion?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm just saying public safety, I guess, focused on protecting the public, prevention and early intervention. That would work, but that's got to be in there as a major, as one of the first things. Because I think if you talk to anybody in the police department, they will say their first duty is to serve and protect. And part of that is by doing prevention and these other things, but we have to, I think that's...
I agree with that. I think protection is usually the #1 thing under public safety. So maybe public safety focused on prevention, prevention and early intervention.
Oh yeah, just throw that in there. There was a constituent request, actually several, to say, and so it would potentially could say public safety focused on protection, prevention, early interventions. Then the suggestions were de-escalation and medically trained community-based crisis prevention and intervention teams like we have with the CPIP. And that was a lot more specific as to what we're already doing. And that is on #2 in the red, the ones that I put on your...
April, can I ask for clarification?
Yeah.
So the one that's in our packet, and this is like a revised one with the community input, is that what this is?
Yeah, I took down all the community input, and for the ones that seem to be consensus,
right,
I tried to, these aren't hard and fast, they're just, I thought it would be easier for us than having a bunch of emails that we all received in the last couple days. Anything else on #2? Michael?
This is a really minor point. All of your points begin with a verb, and that one is just, it's not, there's no verb in there. So you might just start, say,
Provide.
focus on, or I don't know, it just, because for style, you asked about
Okay.
#2.
Provide. All right. Terry?
I would suggest before we move forward with this thing on public safety that we get some input from the new chief in terms of how this works with them, because doing this in a vacuum with us, I don't think works very well.
That sounds like a pretty good suggestion.
Chief
Yeah.
Dahl
You know?
and Mayor, and we also in the House have Mayor Kelly, Peter Rufato, attorney, and then Darlene Peterson, if you feel like you need or would like to join us, court administrator. Chief Dahl,
That's okay.
you're so far away.
Well, thank you. I'm David Dahl. I'm your new police chief and honored to be here. This is the first time I've seen this document. And to your point, Councilman Borman, I do appreciate your inclusion of the concept of service and protection, because that's one of the main tenets of what we're all about. I also like many of the other things in this document because I think it really reflects where we're headed, especially with our strategic plan. When we look at things such as outreach, the research-based programs that are out there, because there are many that are going on throughout the country that we look at all the time and that are part of our strategic plan and where we're going. So, I mean, I like a lot of what I see right now, and I can certainly comment on others as they come up.
April? Oh, hi. I'm sorry, I was talking to someone about homelessness out in the hallway. If I could suggest that we don't put too many specifics in, because if we do, when we're having these discussions with the county, this is where we have to talk about those. We don't want to look like that's an inclusive list, and it's not. And I really like focusing on protection, prevention, and early interventions. I think that's a perfectly good measuring stick to look at our final product and say, how did that turn out? And all these other things, I think, in some ways, divert focus from the actual core of what we're trying to accomplish. So as you're going through these, I would suggest trying to look at them as kind of like statements of purpose rather than how we're going to get there, because how we're going to get there is step 2. But what we're going to achieve is the goal in step 1. So I would just ask if we could look at that, because it makes the document, first of all, more readable, because it has less words. And secondly, it makes it very clear the things that are most important to us to achieve and not do.
I have to agree with the mayor on this one, putting in all those, because we're not going to end up putting an exhaustive list of everything. And these do imply that, so I much agree when we're setting these principles that we should be setting overarching kinds of things instead of getting down to.
So we got number 2. And number 1, there was suggestion to add immigrant status to the list. Is anybody opposed to that?
I think that just is part of our current practice. So if you're going to list everything else,
Might as
though
well.
I don't necessarily know if we have to list everything, because we do everything. But if you want to, then I don't see a reason why that shouldn't be included. But I'd also say, is there an overreaching goal or statement that is inclusive, that doesn't list everybody out, so anyone who isn't potentially included on this list will come back and say, you need to add me. That's what I used to find in statewide policies, is the list always got longer because a different circumstance came up and there was another consideration, instead of just saying, we don't discriminate against anyone for anything.
But yeah, I think what I'm hearing in the community is, I mean, that's certainly a statement we've been saying for decades, and discrimination continues. So a lot of the literature now is, a lot of these words have almost just become so routine, diversity, inclusion, that the frame now is to really state very specifically what you're talking about. And then if new groups do come up, we can have those conversations on what that discriminatory practice looks like. Pinky?
I actually was going to say something similar. I think for this first point, I do think that we could make this a little bit simpler, specifically number 2. But I really like that we're opening our ordinance with actually spelling out all of the different categories, because you're right, things just become generalized, and I think they just become washed over, and really saying all the things that are important to us, I think, makes a really strong statement.
But there's also the set of principles, kind of like, and I'll use a non-secular term for a secular activity, the 10 Commandments. It didn't go into all the aspects of how you could sin in a million different ways.
Right.
That kind of comes, I believe, from the document that goes with this. Because if we were going to just be doing this document, and this was going to guide us from now until forever, I would say put as much in there as you can. But this is a document that would guide the plan that we implement and then we sign on and then you approve, that has to include everything. And I wouldn't want to make the mistake that this is all the categories, because right now I can tell you probably isn't.
Okay.
So anyway, that's just my opinion, just to make it clearer.
It's Crystal. Terry?
I can live with what's in here, but I do also agree that we could end the thing with free of discrimination, discriminatory practices, period. Because, and without putting them all, but, you know, I'm not going to, if it's the will of the council to
Right.
put those in, that's fine.
Yeah.
On this one, I can, you know, this isn't a big deal for me.
Yeah, I think that would be a good one for council to decide. Michael, you had a question?
Yeah, I thank you for letting me step in. I'm not on this committee, but when I read this document, I actually struggled with it. I couldn't figure out where it was going or what it was doing. It's not that every single thought in here was a good one, and I supported it. Some of them were more general. Some of them are very specific. And I think maybe that's a bit what Mayor Kelly is touching on. I'm not sure what level this document is aimed at yet, and I don't know if we've quite hit it right. Kelly suggested, I hadn't heard this before, that maybe there might be a more general document, this one, and then a more specific one.
Well, obviously, we're going to start talking to I think, Dan and Pinky and myself, or Dan and Michael and myself, whoever's on which committee I'm on, I don't remember. But we're going to start talking about the plan. And one of the things that I've been very clear with the county is it isn't enough to have the principles, though I think our principles should be very clear. So if they're violated, we can stand up and be very specific about we are discriminating against this group of people. But there will be, I believe, there needs to be a plan, a criminal justice plan, that after we figure out the low barrier shelter, which is our very first step because it's an emergency, but this group stays together because we need to look at the criminal justice system in our community. That's ongoing. That's bigger than, you know, originally what we were talking about. But I think that having great, pithy things we stand for will guide a plan that gets developed.
Well, I got to what I'm saying when I'm struggling with this is it seems to me that several of these statements are aimed at kind of different levels. And you're talking about the pithy top statements, and I think those are good, but to me, they're also not enough. There needs to be some more specificity. So, I mean, Terry said, for example, you could rewrite one very simply to say that in the application of law enforcement and justice, we seek to be completely non-discriminatory. Right? And then there's a more specific statement, oh, by the way, here are the classes that we know are protected. Here are other classes that may not be federally protected, but nonetheless we respect. And, you know, it seems to me you need both levels, and right now this one document is a little unwieldy. I think we can get there. I think it's aiming in the right direction. I just don't know right now all the words. I'm not sure whether they're aimed correctly and can be read by third parties or by us in the future and say, well, here's what we said, and be really clear about what we meant. So I love where it's going, but I'm having a struggle with the words at the moment about their level.
We have 5 more minutes to talk about this today. So, Terry.
I was just going to say, you know, one of the documents that I kind of look at when we talk about principles is the council had struggled with and worked with developing this whole set of principles in terms of how we set our budgets and other things. And I can't remember what that term is now that we use, you know, the different, what?
The legacies?
The legacies, those principles. And it covers those, you know, and those we worked really hard to craft them so that they would, you know, when you read it, you know what that means, and it's this overarching principle that you build on and guide the documents that come under it. And that's what I'm assuming these guiding principles are. We set out these guiding principles that we build the plans under and do legislation we look at. So,
Okay.
but yes, so whatever we decide on that other, but yeah.
All right. Pinky.
Okay.
I'm probably just repeating myself. I do support making some of these a little bit simpler.
Okay.
But I feel very strongly about that first point, including all of these, because I think what's happening in our society is people are saying discriminatory practices, and yet they're still happening. So they're like, what about me? And I think it's really important that we are trying, and you're right, Mayor, we may have left somebody out, and that might happen, but I'd like to try and be as inclusionary as possible and spell these out. So,
Okay.
but the rest, I think, could use a little bit more refining, but that one I feel strongly about putting definitions on the table.
Okay, is there any other specific ones, Terry?
Yeah, I've got two real specific ones. 9, I'm not sure why we have the fiscally responsible statement under the justice principles. That's something that is just something that goes in all of our programs, and I don't know why that one was stuck in there, is it doesn't seem to relate specifically to just the regular justice principles that you're outlining here.
Did you get a
Just-
chance to watch our last committee meeting?
What?
Did you get a chance to watch our last committee meeting? 'Cause we
I didn't
discussed
under this one.
Okay. This was something that came up, because what we're looking at too is something to not only have as a Justice Committee and a council as we're making further decisions related to justice, but also for the mayor as she's going out and talking with other agencies on what we're going to do. So this is really prioritizing that cost sharing, resource sharing across governments and nonprofits.
And, yeah.
Yes, Terry?
And then 13, I
Wait,
don't.
are we good with 10? Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, maybe it's the framing, because maybe if people didn't have prior knowledge
Right.
of what that came from, we could find a different way to say it. But I know what you're referring to, but this might not be
But this
clear.
does-
So we might want to look at how we're saying number 9,
Right.
to spell it out more clearly about joint sharing of fiscal responsibility.
Yeah, because in this document, it doesn't seem to fit within your other principles.
It did come out of the
Yeah.
last committee meeting, though.
Okay. So is that something you want to come up with a statement on that you could draft for me? Okay. All right. Pinky, did you have anything that you wanted to discuss on here specifically?
No, but I've been through this ordinance about 4 times now, so.
Okay. And Terry?
So I've got 2 more, but
Okay.
the one is 13. This one doesn't seem to fit at all within these. These others are principles, and this one is asking councils to support legislation that we've never seen, that we don't know what is, and the saying support future that shouldn't, I don't feel that belongs within the guiding principles. If you have specific things that you're directing, we should support healthy food or whatever, but this is asking this council and future councils to support things and concepts that I don't believe this one belongs here, and I don't think, especially the such as's should be in there. Yeah, but I don't think it belongs at all, because this is something that I can never support, because asking me to support future legislation that I haven't seen is kind of like the Republicans saying, vote for this budget that they didn't even get a chance to see it, and say, yeah, I'll support future legislation that support. And so I don't think that belongs there.
Just a second, we got to let, are you done? So just one second, Pinky Ellen first. So you don't believe that we should make a statement that says support future legislation that corrects systemic inequalities by allowing resources equitably, oh, sorry, there's a little missed thing there, though, to ensure all residents have the ability and resources to reach their fullest potential? You don't support that statement?
I don't support the way it's written there. No, I don't, because it says
Pinky?
support we don't know what that legislation will
Thank you,
say
Terry.
and how it will
Pinky?
say it.
Well, I think
And
all
this
of,
can be used to come back to say, well, in the principles.
Hey, one
yeah.
moment.
Thank you,
I'm
Terry.
sorry.
thank you.
Pinky?
So I think that all of the work that we've done for the last couple of months have proven that a lot of our inequity around justice-related things have to do with other things that are systemic in our society. And that's how people have access to transportation, where they live, how they eat. All of those things we have talked about over and over again for the last couple of months about how this does affect our justice system. And for us to ignore this seems like we're not listening to the work that we are actually doing here. And I think that it is important for us to set guidelines on our future decisions. That's what we're supposed to do. So I do support it being in there.
So I'm going to go Michael and then Mayor Kelly. You have something?
Thank you. I'm writing down words that might help. I half agree with Terry. It does seem like it's going too far afield, but I also half agree with Pinky. There is a connection there, and I think the statement doesn't make clear what the connection is. Sometimes there are root causes that lead to inequitable outcomes in the justice system. And it'd be nice if we recognized when those root causes lead to inequitable outcomes. But as is written now, it just refers to all inequities, which are maybe bad in their own right, but it isn't focused on just outcomes. So maybe if there's a way to rewrite this, it has to do with, when and where there are causes that lead to unfair or inequitable outcomes in the justice system, we should address those root causes. And that maybe goes to one of the earlier principles that talks about, prevention and early intervention. Then it seems to make more sense, and it stays within kind of the justice realm.
Okay, Mayor Kelly?
Another way to approach this potentially is to make sure that you have an accountability like ongoing adaptive management or policy review or whatever it is, without listing everything in here, that says, and one of the things that does that's very important is it makes the discussion of our criminal justice system ongoing. So it's not like once we do the principles and once we do the plan, then we're all done. It says continuously evaluate how we're doing and make corrections based on whatever is not making the system move forward. So I personally, if I was writing this, I'd write it more that way because it's all inclusive. And then obviously this is a defining issue that's more specific than what we want to commit to doing, which is continuous evaluation or continuous improvement or whatever it is that makes this a living document and not a shelf art document.
Yeah. Just a second, Terry. So we are past our time for this particular document. We have two other items. So Terry, I'll take your comment and then I would suggest that in the next 2 days, since I have to have a packet ready to go soon, that the Justice Committee send in your suggestions for changes to that. And Mayor, I'm happy to look at yours as well. And then we can come back and have another discussion next time.
Yeah.
Yes.
One, in this general principle of these things, I think are good. But in terms of how we're wording it and then throwing in a couple examples, again, that does these things, that I think should be out. But the other part that I have problems with is the last sentence, because it's something that we can't live up to ensure all residents have the ability and resources to reach their fullest potential. We can work to improve systemic inequalities within the system. We are not ever going to have the money to allocate towards this for everybody in the system to reach their fullest potential. So I think we have to, it's one thing to make nice statements, but we have to, when we're putting this out there, we need to word it in a way that is realistic on how we can do things. And I think that goes a little too far in terms of our statement about what we're able to do.
Well, I wholeheartedly disagree, so this is one that I'll probably take all the way to the council. I think that exactly what Pinky said and Michael said a little bit there is that we have systems, and we have gross inequalities in those systems. We have people camping outside right now to let us know that we have gross inequalities in those systems.
Right.
And then they are disproportionately impacted by the justice system because of the position that they're put in. Terry, just a
I
moment.
agree.
So this is certainly, I absolutely do not see how this is a negative statement in any way, saying support future legislation that corrects systemic inequalities by allocating resources equitably to ensure all residents have the ability and resources to reach their fullest potential. And if you want to take out the specifics, those were specific things that we have heard from our community: land use, transportation, access to healthy food, quality public education. Those are things that we've been working on in our committees. They're things that have come up in our community. So I was just putting those specific in there, and I'm happy to take those specific out. But yeah, I
That
would
would go
totally
a ways.
disagree with you on that. But I think for here, Pinky, maybe final statement?
I
and
have
then
a
we can
very
work together?
quick suggestion that might be a little bit of a compromise here. What about, instead of to ensure all residents, to support all residents?
Yeah.
So then it's,
Right.
because we might not have the capacity to ensure everything,
Yeah.
but we can support us getting there. Would that be a reasonable compromise?
That I totally support, because I support the ability, to work with people to reach their full potential. But to say that we can do that
So we're okay with the statement, but just put support instead of ensure?
on that
Okay,
statement,
great.
that part
Michael,
of it.
I'll be happy to have your comments. That'll be great, and the community as well. There's
Oh.
no huge rush, except for the mayor will be stepping into conversations around jail and jail use agreements, so we'll do that. Yes, Mayor?
Could I
Kelly?
ask for a quick definition?
Go ahead.
Just one quick one. Trauma-informed practices. That's not a commonly known term, so could you explain that? Because people read that
Yeah, we'll stick a definition with it so you can understand it
because
better. Mayor Kelly?
One of the things, I know we have our meeting this week. I'm not assuming that the very first meeting we have, we're going to be talking specifically about, hopefully, a more specific thing than a more broad thing, which is the location of a low-barrier shelter. That was kind of what started part of this. You've had an excellent discussion about how you feel about the different words and what they mean and how we put documents together. And if, just for me as the elected mayor of the city, I would really like it if we don't rush this, but make sure it's right. We don't need it by Thursday because we have many other things to talk about, and we might want to ask the county council members to bring their principles too, and we could maybe compare how we do. But I like the discussion you're having because it's a real discussion and it's a real debate. And so often we don't have these in city council, and it's something that the whole council should talk about too, and educate the public on what we're doing so there aren't any misunderstandings that if we just put a principle out there, we are leaving people out, because the principle is there to make sure we don't.
Okay. All right. With that, we'll move on to our second agenda item, request for convening jail stakeholders. So do you want me to hand that over to you, Mayor, or I don't see Brian. Hand it out to me. I think it was. Oh, good.
They have to move forward at the county level to determine what we're... Sure, Dale. They've been meeting as a group over in the county, I don't know how extensively, to talk about first steps in remodeling of the jail and that kind of thing. And my request to Jack was that we use the committee, if we can put one together, that has some input about the needs before we talk about the investments. And so basically, this letter was to say, let's do that. There was a committee that Pinky and I can't remember who else were going to be on, the oversight board, and there seems to be a desire to change both what we call it and actually what it does. But I guess that was my whole goal in this, is getting together county, city, small city people representing the small cities to actually talk about the needs before we move forward on big investments.
Okay, committee members? Pinky?
We are on the next agenda item, right? Okay.
We're on what? We're
So
on
I'm
jail.
curious about the Law and Justice Committee that Sheriff Belfo discussed in this memo. In regards to, when do they meet right now?
I don't think they
Is
meet
this in
right now.
practice? That's
No.
what I'm.
No, so I think the idea was, we should talk about what we'd like to do. I've heard discussions about calling it different things or using existing committees or whatever. And I think that it started out being more specific, and now the measure didn't pass. So now if we think it should be different, I think we should say something.
And so what I understood in attending the last meeting was that there's a state mandate to have one of these committees. It was formed, it really didn't go very far. The sheriff was asking for it to come back. The sheriff also mentioned that, maybe since we already have this task force, a lot of the same people are on it, if we could pull out some of those. And then there was a great suggestion by the mayor is, right now, if you have so many committee members, it makes it very hard to get things done. So how could we parse that down? So I think there's more discussion to be had at the task force to figure out what that's going to look like. Dan, you had a question?
Yeah, I'd like to thank the chair for recognizing me. I'm not on this committee. There are two directions here in this memo. One is the smaller Finance and Operations Board, or whatever the incarnation, whatever the name is of this, and then there's the Law and Justice Council, which is statutorily required by counties.
Or something
Or
else.
some type of entity. So we have the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force. I'm trying to understand what is the direction here that you're intending to go.
I would like some indication on the part of the council that they think putting this group together is a good idea. Whatever we call it, that we talk about the composition, who's on it, and the sheriff has told me personally that he is willing to sit down and talk about this. So I think direction from the council about what you think is important for me to have before I sit down with the sheriff. And I also think it's probably going to be important to discuss it with the prevention and carcinal, whatever that group is.
Incarceration
We
task
sit on
force,
all
yeah,
the time.
prevention.
I think it's probably also important that if the sheriff and I discuss this, which I have been requested to deal with the sheriff and not the county executive, so I will do that, on the jail issue. So I think that it's important, since we're both members of that and we both pretty regularly attend, that it can come before that group too for their input and what they think.
Did you have a follow-up, Dan?
Well, I mean, thank you. Is this to provide some direction for after June 30th of 2018?
And we've talked a lot about the fact that we didn't look at alternatives before we determined a jail size. There were a lot of things that kind of were just repeated from one proposal to the next, even though we made, I think, some good improvements on the second jail proposal. There's still things that we need and that we'd like to give input to, if it's the way we handle the jail population with equity, which I think is an important thing, and what we invest in to get the best outcomes for both the victims and the people we're putting in a facility or not in a facility, what alternatives we're using. I'm hoping that it'll be a little bit broader based discussion than, because the initiative didn't pass, than it would have been if we were already locked into a funding system and a JIUA or whatever it is, and that we have a chance to talk about what we need, the outcomes we need out of a criminal justice system and jail facilities.
Pinky?
Darlene, am I saying that? Okay.
Yeah,
Darlene said yes, so you know I was right.
the authority.
Mayor, I completely support us having these kinds of conversations with the sheriff. I think one of the challenges we've had over the last couple of years is the fact that everybody's making decisions in silos. And and it is not comprehensive for all of us, and we're not solving anything because we're each want different pieces of the puzzle. So I think this is a really critical time for us to have those conversations and have them together, because it's very clear what some of our needs have been unveiled in regards to our process with the Incarceration Prevention Task Force. And to implement some of those things, what we learned for the Vera report, and kind of look at how we're operating, because right now we are not operating the same in our current jail. And there are different policies for this group and different policies for the city, et cetera. And I think it's really critical for us going forward that we are all on the same page. So I don't know what, I think this Law and Justice Committee seems pretty huge and maybe a little too big to make decisions. Something that could be maybe a compromise on the suggestion of the Oversight Board and the Law and Justice. Maybe there's some sort of fit we could have there that is a little bit leaner. But I think we need to start having these discussions immediately in whatever board capacity that should be, because we need to do this together. We've been saying that forever, and I really think
we have
that
the
needs to happen.
opportunity now. We have some willingness on the part of the sheriff to have the discussions. You can ask Darlene questions about, we have 6 months or less, obviously, to understand what's going to happen when our contract expires. So both the police department, the courts, the legal department, we've all been talking about this regularly, especially the staff. So I think it's important for us, and I guess this is a little specific. I wish Brian was here. He could probably explain it better. I don't know. You might be able to, Peter. But after the jail measure failed, what I wanted was a more general request that we get together with the county and talk about what we need out of the current system, whether it's the practices or the facility.
Yes, and Peter, do you want to go ahead, or, okay. Terry, you can go after Peter.
Peter Ruffato. So my understanding of this is, we really need to have some short-term focus. I know there may be some long-term, like that larger group, but right now, I think the idea of this is, at least for now, to really figure out how we use the jail. It doesn't have to be to the exclusion of alternatives, but how do the different jurisdictions use it, and how can we have a focused, really problem-solving group to figure out, if they're going to do improvements that are going to limit capacity even further. How do we make sure that there's something there for the city in terms of holding for the right period of time, and then we work together and not make those decisions separately.
Terry?
Yeah. If you're looking at one option or the other on these,
No.
no. But I do feel if you're looking at getting results, the first one makes a whole lot more sense than the Law and Justice Committee, because I'm very familiar with that one, and I've known administrators that have tried to work with it and trying to get things done with it. It's a good vehicle for discussion to go out over a lot of systems, but not to really pull things together. And I really support the idea of a group meeting to start working and discussing those. And I do think a smaller kind of group of legislators, administrator, makes a whole lot more sense than trying to work within the Law and Justice Committee, because I think that's way too unwieldy to get done what I think we would like to do and what you would like to do.
I think this it proves a point that I've said many times, and I just did it myself, so shame on me. As soon as you put things in writing, people focus on your words instead of what you want to achieve or attain. And what I want to attain is some changes in what we need in order to continue to operate our municipal court and housing our inmates, or not housing them, both, and that there be some equity in it. And I would like that to happen before we make big investments in something, or at least agree with the investments that are being made. As I was told, I have no authority to tell anybody what to do, and I understand that. There are areas where someone doesn't have any authority to tell me what to do either, but in this particular case, it behooves us to work together, and that's what I would really like to do, because how many of our Yakima people are pretrial?
Darlene Peterson, about over 60% are pretrial.
Yeah.
So we definitely have a big need in the current system, and it will only get greater, so.
So for me, there's two conversations we need to have before that specific direction is given. I'm glad it's because it's going to take us a while to figure out how we're going to go about doing that. One is the principles, because there's very specific things in those principles, like all pretrials being treated equally no matter where they're arrested or where they reside, or where the charging, I guess, jurisdiction is, that we would want to hold the people that are presumed innocent locally, just because of all the problems that it creates, taking them away from their community and also having access to attorneys. That's something that we've recognized, and we're spending a lot of money to ensure that our pretrial inmates or those are in Yakima are having that access. The second one is a conversation that I think we need to have with Judge Lev that will help guide us in making sure that we're together on what we're thinking, and have her inform us as we move forward. And that comes from page 10 of the VERA process, and it was under administrative data analysis, but it had what I thought were two great questions to ask our judge and to see her opinions on these things and then we're at. And one was admissions into the jail. Like who do we want to book into a jail? And then the second one was average daily population, length of stay, and how long do we want people to be there? And I think having that conversation with Judge Love is like, what do we want to use a booking and holding facility for? Would be
Yeah.
a really good conversation.
And just so you know, that Darlene gives Judge Lev some of that information so
Oh,
she can
yes.
make up her mind. So
Oh, yeah.
I don't want to minimize Darlene's role in this. She's been so instrumental. But yeah, it's good to
Yeah.
know all that. I think, though, I'm going to be talking to Elfo, Sheriff Elfo this week.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's some general consensus that a group, after we get our principles or whatever input you want to give is important, then it gives me something to talk to him about. If I don't have that direction, then I'll be out there making statements and promises about working together that I can't keep.
And that's where I felt like our guiding principles, and of course that conversation with Judge Lev, who, everybody's been working so well together, but I think it's just a great opportunity, maybe even in our next meeting, to have that conversation of what do we want to use it for.
Yeah.
I do think that there are a couple guiding principles, if we could agree on sooner than later. One is that pretrial, that we feel like that's not an equity, that's an equality, that people who, if we're going to have to limit jail population, we'd certainly like.
April, just so you know, the principles that you have in here are how I operate. So you don't have to worry that those principles won't be expressed when I'm talking to Elfo.
I'm not what you're asking me for specifics, so I was trying to
Yeah,
give
and
you
I
what
was
you asked for.
just saying what I need now is more
Okay.
of a direction that you think it would be useful to do some kind of a joint conversations. And that's why I wish maybe this didn't look like it does, because it looks kind of like, well, pick this way or pick that way. And that isn't really the direction I need now.
Pinky?
I have a suggested direction.
Okay.
Discussing with Sheriff Elfo, if we could convene a team, I believe the team that we use for the jail task force to work out the logistics around funding and programs, that was good representatives of all the people that were at the table to make that are involved and affected by these decisions. It's not too big, and it has, I believe, most of the key members. If we could possibly take a look at extending that team to look at a short-term focus to figure out for the next 3 months what we need to do right now.
And I would suggest that it was the right size group to have that kind of a initial discussion. I would not necessarily agree that everybody that was on that group are the right people to have on the group, but the makeup
And it may not be the exact people,
Right.
but I believe the representations from those groups, it might be a different person, but that was a small enough group, and everyone understood the objectives, and maybe we could outline it, is just right now, like our attorney Peter Rufato said, a short-term focus to determine those things, so we're all on the same page, and then maybe look long-term at what we have to do after that.
Okay, Terry, and then Michael has a question.
So, Pinky, am I hearing you make a motion that we're supporting the mayor to do that? And if so, I'll second it. If that's, because I think, that way it'll make it.
How does that, oh, okay, I guess I'll find out if I make a motion, if we support it or not. So I do make a motion that we do a short-term focus to determine our next, see, now I have to make a motion, I have to be specific about my words, that we make a motion to form a short-term focus group based on the attendees that were in the jail task force group. So the representatives don't have to be the same, but representatives from all of those to determine our next couple, our first quarter decisions around the jail.
So, okay.
Does that meet what you
That
need?
meet what you mean or not really?
Yeah.
Okay.
If that meets the need, then I'll gladly, I second that idea
Okay. So it was
and the emotion.
Michael and Dan.
Thank you. I think Pinky is directly on target. I'm going to disagree with you. I'm glad you put this memo forward with the two options, even if both options are being rejected. I think it actually helped focus the discussion. The Finance and Operations Board that was envisioned, I think, is too narrow, and as people pointed out, the Law and Justice Council's got nearly 50 people on it. It's existed on paper for decades, and it's never been terribly functional. It probably could have been, but the county's never used it. Or use it very intermittently, so that's wrong. I think Pinky's right. The former stakeholders group was about the right size and about the right range of representation, and I support the motion also dealing with a short-term objective. We have 6 months before our current agreement expires. Before that time, we should have both short-term objectives about what we're going to do at the end of the 6 months in terms of handling the capacity concerns, and then turn to the longer-term issues, which is what you mentioned here, Kelly. You say focus both on facilities use, which I think is a short-term issue, and continue implementing the alternatives to incarceration, because it has to do with the number of people and the use, the heaviness of the use of the jail long-term and any future jail long-term. So I really appreciate that. I think the Incarceration Reduction and Prevention Task Force is not quite the right group. It has a certain focus, certain representation. That wouldn't be the right body. And as I said, the Law and Justice, the Oversight Board, I think, was too narrow, and it was really focused on the jail. So I do think we need to define clearly what the scope is, and I like Mr. Rufato's suggestion that there's a short-term concern and then also there's a longer-term concern. So if the motion is understood as that, convening this mid-sized group that has the representation pretty close to what the stakeholders group does to focus on solving the operational capacity limitations in the next 6 months, so when June happens, we're not in trouble, and then really never losing track of that alternatives and incarceration reduction piece, because that's what got us into this problem in the first place.
And I think April's right. There's there's a few things like equity and, not sending people that haven't been convicted of anything out of the community that are part of the short-term solution. But it gives us a chance to refine our principles and also then to carry forward, because this is not something that can last until June.
Thank
We
you,
need
ma'am.
to know way before June what the options are for us as far as booking and holding. And David, do you have booking, holding, and something else?
We have lots of booking, holding, and something else desires, and it's really important that we be part of this conversation as well, because it has a tremendous impact on the quality of service that we can deliver if I've got people driving throughout Washington State to get people into custody and place them into a booking facility.
Okay, so I'll have Dan and then Darlene if you have anything to follow up. Dan, you were waiting.
Thank you. So I don't know what the exact composition of that jail group was, but I think that we do need to have a representative from the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force, simply because.
There is one on that team.
Okay, great. So, and to your point earlier about the silos that we have, there is longer-term and mid-term work that task force is doing that will inform, to some degree, the booking and holding needs in the shorter term, but those absolutely have to be addressed because we have a real practical issue with that. But the pretrial risk assessment and the ground-level response and coordinated engagement program and the triage facility, which is a much later because it's tied up with the capital.
You went offline there.
Sorry, thanks. Those tools will have an impact on the amount of people that we're talking about that would enter or not enter the facility. So I just want to make sure that we're de-siloing, that we are all kind of on the same page with this process.
So what I'm hearing for your motion is direct the mayor to work with Sheriff Elfo to develop a small working group to come up with short-term solutions such as facility usage and capacity and long-term objectives to alternatives to incarceration, something like that?
And it doesn't even have to be that
Okay.
specific. I think basically we need to go with what Peter said about short term, understanding we're developing principles.
Okay.
And two of our principles are equity and
Yeah. Darlene?
I just was going to briefly add that in our presentation here, we're going to talk a little bit about the numbers, so
Yeah.
it might be helpful.
Yeah, I think we could hopefully move on to our next item. So with that, do you have what you need? Oh, I guess we need a vote, I'm sorry. So for now, we'll go with the language that I have since we don't have any other language.
Just
So
adapt one
to-
thing, April.
Yes,
Is to include that, use the proposed recommendation from the task force committee, because that includes the chief of police, someone from the prevention task force. It does include all of those members. So as that is our guiding membership,
which task force?
the jail stakeholder task force.
Okay, just so everybody's clear, I'm going to restate so we know what we're voting on, but direct the mayor to work with Sheriff Elfo to develop a small working group that represents or use the proposed recommendations of the jail stakeholder task force makeup to develop short-term recommendations for addressing facility capacity and long-term objectives for alternatives to incarceration. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. We'll move on to our next item. So we're going to be pushing into the next committee. My apologies. Criminal justice and public safety impacts to the city budget. Is it you, Chief, that's going to give this presentation, or start with Peter?
Peter's going to start us off.
City attorney or mayor? Pick one.
I always feel sometimes like I'm just a placeholder, but Peter's the one that knows about this, so he'll make the presentations for us. Go ahead.
So Brian Heinrich wasn't able to make it today, but he helped get us together. And this is really an information-only item that is part of a series that we've been presenting to the Justice Committee, starting with sort of the basics on the criminal justice system, with the timeline, starting with police, and then we talked about the prosecutor's role, municipal court. So the intention of this was then to get into the budget implications. It is not meant to get into a lot of detail. It is not meant to get into budget changes, because that's a separate process that you guys are in the middle of. But it's really part of that, trying to just focus on the criminal justice system and the different aspects of it. And you know, with the budget, that's obviously where the council has the greatest role in terms of the criminal justice process. A key reminder, you know, when we talk about the police role versus the legal department, the prosecutor's office, and the municipal court, you know, the police deal with a much broader range, not only in the function in the public safety system, but also they do address felony. They investigate felonies. But our prosecutor's office in the municipal court only deals with gross misdemeanor, civil infractions, and code enforcement. So with that, we just have a few slides, starting with police, then municipal court, and then the legal department. So I'll turn it over to Chief Dahl.
Thank you, Peter. So this is an overview of how we strategically use the community's dollars that are entrusted to us. And as you can see in the very bottom, the majority of our money gets spent on uniform patrol. These are the folks that you would see in uniforms out on the street, to include our patrol, our traffic, our canine, PEOs, and our neighborhood anti-crime team. We are so grateful and thankful to you, City Council, and to Mayor Kelly for your continued commitment in helping us to add personnel to that particular group to help us to achieve the outcomes of our staffing study, which helps us to ensure that our people have what we call that 50-50 split, that amount of obligated and unobligated time to respond to calls for service, as well as do some community policing, getting out and contacting people, because that makes quite a difference. You're going to see, if I move up to the administrative services, that's not all money that's just spent on my office. That's pass-through money and some of the money that we have to pay for our pension for all of our officers, our facilities, like the little box up there and the little bubble up there in the top says we spend money to animal control, detox, and the DV commission as well. But all of the other pieces of the pie show you where those dollars go. And if you have any specific questions about one of those pieces of pie, I can certainly point them out to you. But the next slide will go into where our jail dollars go. And you can see that this is just 1 year's expenses right now, and if you did add up the percentages, you'll note that we are over 100%, which means that we're going to be over budget in what we predicted to be for our jail expenditures this year. We're predicting to be about a little over $1.5 million. 70% of that is for Whatcom County Jail, 28, Yakima, and 7 to Friendship Diversion. And Darlene will have some specific numbers for you, or numbers that she can give to you in regards to the number of people that we have going to those particular agencies.
Darlene?
Okay. Thank you. The chart that you're looking now shows you since 2014 how our expenses have been going. The dark line is what we were spending for the Whatcom County Jail. The gray, which is in 2016 and 17, those bars are for Yakima, and then the green are for FDS. You'll notice that Yakima has doubled this year, and that FDS has more than doubled. While our jail costs are going down, they're still significant. And to give you some perspective, in 2016, the city of Bellingham had approximately 920 bookings. And the reason I say approximate is I'm basing these all on numbers that I'm getting off the public websites for the jail, because I do not get any concrete numbers. But so out of 920 bookings, a quarter of those are let out at their first arraignment. So a quarter of the people that are booked walk out of jail the day they have their arraignment. And then what I wanted to do was kind of give you an idea of numbers. In 2016, that gray bar that we have for expenses, for Yakima, 212 people were sent over to Yakima. No, excuse me, 143 people were sent over to Yakima in 2016. And that little tiny green bar represents 212 defendants that were put on bracelets. So that's a huge percentage of those 820 or 920 bookings. In 2017, the last group of bars, 300 of those people were sent to Yakima, and that is steadily increasing because of the pretrial. And so far through November, we have put over 300 people on bracelets. And when I say on the EHM or bracelets, these are people that have completed. So in your conversations of what is needed for coming up in June when our contract is due, you can see that we're doing our best to put a lot of people on bracelets to keep them out of jail, but there's a significant number of people that are still being booked and will need to be booked. And when they are picked up and put in Whatcom County Jail, there's an initial $100 booking fee for every person. Then we have until their arraignment to decide what we're going to do. If there's any way we can let them out, we put them on a bracelet, and that has significantly increased that we have a lot of pretrial people who normally would have stayed in jail that we're able to let out. Then the rest that have to stay, the bulk of those people have to be sent over to Yakima. So you can see we are definitely going to need, in June, whatever happens with the contract, we're going to need a booking facility for all of those people until we can decide where they'll be able to go next. And then on the next page, this is kind of a layout of the Bellingham Municipal Court budget. I'm not going to go through all of the categories. I tried to list them out here for you by colors. I want to make sure that you know this does not include jail funding because that comes through the police department. And this does not include paying for our public defenders, which is in the general fund, because that would be a conflict of interest for the court. And for a 2-year period, we pay $1,610,000 for public defender representation. That's the least. It goes up from there because of a few other expenses. But over half of the people that we have coming through court are represented by public defenders and are indigent. So that's something to keep in mind. The only other thing I will add to this for the court is that sustaining these kinds of programs and running the programs and the administration of these programs is really coming to the point of strain and stress in the court where we're going to need some added help. The amount of hours that it's taking to monitor these, to make sure that people are in compliance, to review them and see who's eligible has really increased. And this is not the conversation for that, but I just need you to know that to continue this and to increase other programs that we would like to see started, we really are going to have to take a look at how municipal court can obtain some more staffing. So with that, I'll go to Peter.
I'd just like to add one thing to what Darlene has said. And the truth is, I believe that if we are unsuccessful in working with the county in getting an equitable treatment of all municipal governments and an agreement that people that have not been convicted, whether they're from the city of Bellingham or someplace else, should stay here until they do have a conviction. And the county decides that maybe some of their longtime felons that are in the jail for a long time would be more appropriate to go to Yakima or Skagit or Score or wherever, rather than our non-convicted inmates. We could probably avoid some of these expenses if we got to use the jail facility and the staff at the jail in a different way. But I think everything that Darlene said is absolutely true. If we are not successful, then we will be kind of on our own dime for our booking and holding, and it's going to cost us much, much more to build a facility.
Well, and I think that brings us to an important conversation. We're a little over time now, but thinking for Plan B, because we have been made promises as to being able to have our pretrials held at our local facility, and many times that never came to fruition. We've had to move them out. I think there's two things that I would like to see the mayor going ahead. I know it takes extra time and resources, but finding out Plan Bs. One, we need some harder numbers on what it will look like to have a temporary booking and holding facility for this community. And then the other one is finding out if it is a full FT, whatever that looks like, to relieve the legal and the municipal court and to find the funding. in a funding request for somebody who can manage all those systems and then make sure that we're bringing in more programs. I don't know what the rest of the committee feels like that, and I don't know, Mayor, as far as timelines. I mean, we're moving into the new year. We have till June. And
Well, I think we could have, we have a communication from the sheriff saying he's going to try to do what we're going to be asking him to do. And they have a contract with Friendship Diversion, I mean, with Yakima now. So it would not take a long time to implement the principles that we're talking about. And I guess what I'd say is, let's see how the conversation goes before we ask staff to spend a lot of time. Now, we can be asking about costs and things, but I would really like us to be spending our time looking at trying to get plan A minus to work. Because it can. I mean, I am very optimistic, as I always am, that if everybody looks at the principle out there and wants to serve the public equitably, that there should be a solution to this with everything that the county is going to have to go through. And I've acknowledged that to Jack, and I've also acknowledged that if there's something we can do to to be a partner, that we're willing to do it for the people that
we've
live
shown
here.
that. Yes, Peter?
Yeah, if I could, I'd just like to go through the legal department real quick. We're over time, and I'm going to do it without mentioning the word jail. In the spirit of keeping this really broad, so these are biennial numbers. That was true of all the numbers that you've seen. You can see that we're driven primarily by personnel costs in the second bullet point. Third bullet point, the number of 1.25 million does not include some of the things we do sort of on the civil side that really supports law enforcement and the courts and general oversight. The one dynamic I would mention that kind of gets into the more specific topic is, well, first of all, the dynamic of what drives the use of resources for our department. One is just the sheer number of cases. If you add police officers, you add patrol time, that generates more infractions, whether they be misdemeanor type infractions or civil infractions. Another thing is our unique processes. So when we talk about things like mental health court or new diversion, those kinds of programs are more time consuming than some of the more straightforward types of prosecutorial processes, because it requires you to have a screening process of some kind. It requires you to have a monitoring. We're going to have to follow up to see if that person followed through on their commitments, so we know whether we have to go to something that's like jail, for example, as opposed to following through with their program. So unique processes tend to require more resources. Another example are additional calendars. If you have an additional mental health calendar or an additional community court calendar, those kinds of things really drive up the need for prosecutorial and other legal staff resources. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay. What do you think, Mayor, as far as a timeline in the new year before we really start focusing and making sure that we do have some practical plan B? So if booking and holding, temporary facilities like that, freeing up time for staff, are you feeling like by February you'll have a pretty good feeling of where you're
Instead of
moving?
getting you a date, why don't I talk with the team to see what that would entail and how long it would take?
Okay.
I would rather give you a firm number, and we have one more meeting in December, and we'll meet and talk about it so that you can get more clear information than me guessing here.
Pinky?
Kind of a plan B, but also maybe something we should take a look at as we're doing this process is, even if temporarily we need to bring on some additional contract help to kind of maybe get through this, like maybe there's something just to support some of the things that Darlene's working on, and maybe we look at that as an option, maybe not having a full FTE until we figure out what we really need, but maybe an option for temporary just to get caught up, or a short term or something like that.
Any closing comments from any other committee members? Chief, you good? All right. So with that, end of committee.
Thank you very much, April. We'll take a brief break. We'll come back with our next committee, which I believe is Public Works.